Hello, the topic of this lecture is the second major moral theory that you're going to get a good look at in this particular course. And this theory comes from a fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant in a writing called The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. This here is an image of Kant. Kant himself was a very interesting figure, was in a lot of ways, was officially the last major figure of the modern period. The modern period we usually mark as going from about 1500 to 1800, but as Kant died in 1804, that makes a very nice logical end, and so sometimes we get a little bit more precise about the end of the modern period than we do about the beginning. You can make various kinds of arguments about who is really, important about the beginning of the modern period, or when you can signal an end to the medieval period and a beginning to the modern period, but it's a little fuzzy there. It's not like anybody woke up some morning and said, oh, goodness, I'm glad we're in the modern period of philosophy and not that medieval period anymore. Nobody really draws a really sharp distinction there. But of course, Kant was a major figure, was a towering figure in the history of philosophy, and had a great many really important ideas that have had a lasting influence on the way we think about a great many things, ethics included. But of course in other fields as well. Kant himself was a very interesting person. He was born, was raised, went to school, worked, lived, and died in Königsberg, which at the time, during his lifetime, was called Prussia, but is in modern-day Germany. And again, he lived from 1724 to 1804. And so Kant here is also interesting because of his personal habits. His personal habits included being very rigid, having a very rigid routine. For example, he would go on the same walk, on the same route at the same time of every day. And people who knew him in Königsberg would say that you could set your watch by him. In fact, there's a famous story where he missed his walk, only on one occasion, and it was because he was lost in thought reading something by David Hume, another colossally important figure of the modern period. The last thing I want to say about Kant is pretty directly involved in how you're going to experience him. Unfortunately, Kant might be the worst writer in the history of writing in terms of his style, right? His organization is all over the place. He sort of, makes up terms all over the place. His sentences are just labyrinths. Sometimes he has this penchant for poetry. Actually, Kant did want to be a poet when he was a younger man, and unfortunately, some of his poetry survives to the modern day. You'll see some phrases where he gets a little bit flowery, and you can see this sort of aspiring Kant the poet peeking through there. So in any case, it's a testament to just how important Kant's ideas are that we continue to slog through Kant's writing. Now, that said, I'll tell you as a student that you don't really know the half of it. So for one thing, the Kant that you're reading is Kant in translation. I actually do know, and many people who work in philosophy also know, people whose first language is German, that is the language that Kant originally wrote in, who yet prefer to read Kant in English, because in most cases the translator has done so much work cleaning up the text and making it more intelligible. So number one, you're reading a translation. Number two, you're also reading a version of Kant that has been edited to within an inch of its life. It's been cut up, it's been made shorter, and it's been reorganized to try and make things as clear as they can be. So the version of Kant that you're dealing with is actually very good and pretty clear and intelligible compared with Kant in its absolute original. So know that it could be very much worse if you're having some trouble really following Kant in a very precise way. But in any case, Kant presents the most famous version of what we'll call non-consequentialist theories of morality. So that said, I want to be clear about some terminology that you'll come across in this particular unit, because the terminology that I tend to use is somewhat different than is standard when discussing these kinds of moral theories and moral ideas. Okay. So first off, any moral theory that does not appeal to the consequences of acts is called a non-consequentialist theory of morality. And that just makes perfect sense. Philosophers are very good at naming things. So a theory that does not appeal to the consequences of any act is called a non-consequentialist theory of morality. Kant issues the most famous version of a non-consequentialist moral theory, but there are plenty of others. And just like there are many different kinds of varieties of utilitarianism. Whenever I am talking about a moral theory that does not appeal to consequences or thinks that consequences are not the only thing that matters, or even that think that consequences don't matter at all to morality, I will call it a non-consequentialist theory of morality. Whenever I'm referring specifically to Kant's version of that theory, I will call it Kant's theory or Kantian moral theory or something like that. Very often you might see a different term applied to non-consequentialist views and specifically to Kant's views, and that term is deontology. And I think honestly that's probably the most common term used to describe Kantian and other non-consequentialist moral theories. I don't use the term following a professor that I had in graduate school who explained why he didn't use that term either, and here's why. Okay, the word deontology comes from a pair of Greek words that means the study of duties, right? Well, all moral theories concern duties of one kind or another. You get duties from utilitarianism, duties from non-consequentialist moral theories. Kant talks about duties. Moral pluralists will talk about duties. Virtue theorists will talk about duties. Everybody who's talking about morality is talking about duties. And so calling just one kind of moral theory a deontological theory seems very silly to me, even though, again, I think that's probably the most common term that's used for theories of these kinds. And that's why you do need to know that term. So again, very often when somebody talks about deontology, they mean specifically to refer to either Kant's theory or some other kind of non-consequentialist theory of morality. For the purpose of this course, Kant's theory is the only non-consequentialist theory that we're going to talk about in great detail, at least until we get to moral pluralism, in which case we're going to see some other versions of non-consequentialist moral theories. So one of the things that we can start in noticing when we start talking about Kant is that you'll notice from the very beginning that Kant is writing his moral theory largely as an objection to consequentialism. Remember, consequentialism is the view that consequences are ultimately all that matters about morality, that an act is good or bad based on what happens when you do it. And so the first clue you get is, in fact, the very first sentence of Kant's reading. He says, nothing can possibly be conceived, which means he means imagined, which can be called good without qualification except a good will. And he continues, a good will is not good because of what it performs or affects, nor by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. That is, it is simply good in itself and considered by itself. Right, so this is a statement very early that is supposed to completely oppose consequentialism. It's supposed to oppose the idea that what makes something good or bad is what happens when you do it. Instead, it's what kind of motive lies behind it. So consequentialist views, like utilitarianism, begin from the very plausible idea that consequences matter to morality, and they explore the idea that perhaps consequences are all that matter. And that's where you get theories like utilitarianism who really do hold that consequences are all that matter. Kant's view is going to take a very different view. Kant's view begins from the plausible idea that intent matters to morality, and will explore the idea that perhaps intent is all that matters. to morality. And so let's take a quick look here at the relationship between duty and inclination. All right, so inclination is one of these special Kant terms. In a sense, an inclination is something that you have a desire to do, right, or something that you have a motive to do. Right. And if we're going to be talking about motives and motives being important to our moral duty, we have to make a clarification. So Kant isn't going to say just that your duty is whatever you have a motive to do. No, no, no. The motive itself actually has to be a good one. And so he's going to draw this kind of a relationship between motives and duty. And so if you're thinking about your duty, you could be thinking about something that an action that is either not in accord with your duty, that is, that it goes against some duty that you have, or an action that is in accord with duty, that is, the action fits a duty that you have. Also, you can do something from a motive or inclination, that is, you can have some good reason to do it, that doing something could fulfill a desire of yours, or you could do something simply because it ought to be done, or simply because it's your duty, not because there's any other reason that you want to do it. Right? And if you take a look at these two possibilities and put them on a kind of table with each other, you get 4 overall possibilities. So one of these is something that you do that's not in accord with duty, but that it's done from a motive of inclination. And a good example of this is something like lying to benefit yourself. And of course, Kant is going to say that an action of this kind has no moral worth, both because it's done just from inclination, that is, it's done just because you wanted to do it, and also because it's not in accord with any duty that you have. So lying is contrary to your moral duty, and the only reason you are doing it is just to benefit yourself. And so we can think of any number of different examples of how that works, why somebody would lie to benefit themselves. And again, it's fairly easy to understand why that action would have no moral worth. It's some of the other ones that are a little bit counterintuitive with regard to Kant's moral theorizing. And if a very careful reading of his text will sort of reveal this very important issue to you. So consider now an action that is done from an inclination, right? Done because you have a desire to do it, but also is in accord with your duty. And so this is where Kant uses examples like an honest merchant, right? Somebody who charges fair prices to everybody, but not because anybody deserves those fair prices, but instead because it's good for business or because it's good for a person's reputation, right? So if the only reason you're telling the truth is to avoid having a bad reputation, and not essentially because people deserve the truth from you, then your act has no moral worth. Because even though it was in accord with your duty, that is your duty to tell the truth, it was done from a motive of inclination, not from a motive of duty, right? And so one of the hardest examples to come up with on this table is this one here, something that is done from a motive of duty, but that's not in accord with duty. And the best I can come up with is some action on some duty that one has misunderstood as one's duty. And I guess such an action would have no moral worth because it really isn't in accord with your duty. But that's the best I can do for that one. But finally, the most important one to Kant is this one down here in the lower right, in which you have an action that is in accord with duty, okay, so that is doing the right thing, okay, and done from a motive duty, that is doing the right thing because you have a duty to do the right thing, right? I actually had a teacher back when I was in middle school who actually later was a boss in a summer job I worked. But one of his favorite things to say was he always encouraged people to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And if you don't think about that very much, it sounds like nonsense. Doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. It sounds circular, but actually it's quite Kantian. It's the idea is you do if your motive for doing the right thing is that it's the right thing and nothing else, not the consequences that come from it, not your desires that are satisfied by doing it, but only the duty to do it, only then is the act morally worthy on this Kantian perspective. So to elaborate on this idea, that the principle of the will, that the reason that you're doing some particular action is the only thing that's relevant to morality. This is where Kant brings in a lot of talk about reason. Okay. And the reason he brings about reason is he thinks that reason is the basis of morality, right? He thinks that all of our moral duties are revealed to us by the exercise of reason. Okay. And this has a couple of consequences, or implications, I should say. Because reason reveals to us only the character of our action principles, this is another Kant special in terms of which he calls these things maxims, these sort of action principles or the reasons why we do things, essentially he calls these things maxims. Then our maxims are the only morally relevant features. It only matters why we're doing a particular thing, and it matters, and again, rational analysis can tell us what our motives are like, okay? They can't tell us what the consequences of our motives will be. Okay, the reason alone doesn't tell us those things. Most of the time, with consequences, we actually have to wait and see what really happens. We can anticipate what we think is going to happen, but if you've ever lived on this planet, you'll know that that doesn't always work. The thing that you think is going to happen is not always, and in fact, is often not the thing that actually happens. And so the idea is that because reason works the same way for everybody, that moral maxims then will be the same for everyone. And we'll come back to this point. And so for any rational being, Kant argues, morality is what he calls categorical, not conditional. Kant uses the term hypothetical here, but I think conditional conveys the meaning a little better. And so if we're going to lay out a kind of argument that Kant really should have laid out, but he doesn't exactly lay it out this way, but if we're going to lay out an argument in a way that where you can clearly say how it runs, here's how it goes. So if only actions in accord with and from duty have moral worth, and if reason alone reveals our duty, that is, the moral law, then acting on what reason tells us is our duty for that reason alone is the only thing that is morally worthy. And so what that means is that for any rational being, rational means sort of able to do certain sort of mental acts, right? For any rational being, the laws of morality apply, and they are unconditional imperatives. Right, so I want to bring in a bit of a note about Kant's terminology, because again, Kant makes up a lot of terms here they're very special to Kant. And so one of the pieces of terminology that's very important to understanding Kant's writing is this difference between what he calls a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. And so a hypothetical imperative is binding only on someone with a certain desire that not everyone has. That is, if you desire academic success, then you would do your reading carefully. Of course, if you didn't desire academic success, well, it doesn't really matter. If you want to be the best pole vaulter in the world, well, then you must practice pole vaulting. If you don't care about pole vaulting, well, then you don't have any obligation to pole vault. So this is what's called a hypothetical imperative. I think a better way to put it in sort of more modern English is conditional imperative, but people still, out of tradition, will translate this part of Kant as a hypothetical imperative. Okay, so the idea is, again, it's a hypothetical imperative is conditional on having a certain desire that not everybody might have. Whereas a categorical imperative is different. That's unconditional. That's categorically binding. That is, the moral law is going to apply to all rational beings just because they're rational. It's not like one of those things where you say, well, if you want to be moral, then you'll do this, that, or the other thing, right? There's that whole first part of it is taken out. You have a duty to be moral, no matter whether you think you have that duty or not, or whether you have a certain set of desires or not. In fact, the philosopher Wittgenstein came up with a very useful illustration that sort of demonstrated this attitude that we have. He said, if you came across a couple of people who were playing tennis, but they were playing it horribly badly, right? Just smacking the ball all over the place, letting it bounce multiple times before they returned it to each other, and you pointed out to them, you're playing tennis very badly, and they replied, yes, but we don't actually desire to play it any better, then you'd be like, well, okay, fine then, right? That you'd sort of accept that. But now imagine somebody told you a preposterous lie, and you said, that's abominable of you, and they say, yes, but I have no desire to behave any better. All of a sudden, that doesn't seem like the same kind of, okay, all right then, right? You say, well, you ought to want to behave better, seems to be the appropriate response. So again, morality is a kind of categorical imperative, right? It doesn't require any specific desires, for anybody to have. And so now, finally, we get to the point where Kant has to specify what actually is the moral law. He's been talking about the moral law, talking about people's duties this whole time, but has yet to supply us with a way of determining what our duty is, what we are categorically commanded to do, right? What is the moral law? And this is the part where, again, Kant's writing really gets the best of us, because depending on which Kant interpreter you ask, there are between 2 and 7 statements of what Kant called the categorical imperative. And I think it seems very clear that Kant himself believed that he was just saying the same thing in a couple of different ways to try and get people to understand it better. Others, right, say that these are fundamentally different principles and that he just gives us several of them. I'm going to remain agnostic on that essential question, and I'm going to present 2 of Kant's statements of the categorical imperative. Again, remember, Kant thought that these 2 sort of amounted to the same thing. I don't really think that they do, but that question is not really essential to really understanding what Kant has to say and having an understanding of Kant that is sufficient for an introductory course in ethics. And so his first statement of the categorical imperative, that is this universal moral law, is this. He says, act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, one of the things I often do when I first present this to students is say, what do you think is the most important word in this entire statement? And nobody gets it until about the 23rd or 24th guess. Okay, all of the words you would think would be really, really important here are not the words that are really, really critical. Of course, the word maxim looks like it should be pretty important, and certainly we're going to have to define that when it's important in the sense that we have to say, okay, what does he mean by a maxim? But actually, the most important word in here is actually the word can. We're going to be talking about that here in a second. Okay, so first let's say, okay, what's a maxim? Okay, by maxim, Kant means a principle of action or an action type. Okay, so it is a kind of act, right, instead of a specific act. So the maxim is supposed to make this sort of a broader imperative, right? So it's supposed to have a broad appeal. So a maxim is sort of a principle of action. That's the best I can do to explain what Kant means here. But the reason why can is the most important word in here is because it is really critical to overcoming certain ways you can misinterpret this first statement of the categorical imperative. So by can, Kant means can here in the sense of logical possibility. So something is logically possible if it doesn't imply a contradiction, right? So for example, it is logically possible that I could jump out the window and fly like Superman. Okay, there's no contradiction there. It is not physically possible, that is, it doesn't accord with the laws of nature as we understand them for me to do that, but it is logically possible. On the other hand, talking about making a square circle, that's logically impossible, right? Because you might say, okay, you've made a square circle. Does it have corners? You say, well, because it's a circle, it does not, and because it's a square, it does. And so something can't have corners and not have corners at the same time, and so that would be logically impossible. Okay, so that's what Kant means here. He means this sense of logical impossibility. And that, keep that in mind, because it'll guard you against some of the most common misinterpretations of this principle. So another way to put this statement, instead of act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, instead of saying that, you could say, if everyone can logically act on some maxim at the same time, then it is permissible morally. If it is not, if not, right, if you cannot, if everyone can't logically act on that maxim at the same time, then it is not permissible for you nor for anyone else. And that's another way to put the statement. So a couple of common misinterpretations of this principle include, first of all, this idea that would actually be consequentialist. Okay, so one way that oftentimes people will explain Kant is they'll say, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to imagine what would happen if everybody did X. Okay. And even people who ought to know better will say that this is what Kant is saying, and it is absolutely not. Remember all the way back to the beginning of Kant's piece, where he very, very clearly says that what makes something moral or immoral has nothing to do with what it results in. It has nothing to do with its consequences. And if you're saying what would happen if everybody did X, is you're saying that what makes something good or bad is what happens if people did it. Right, and that's consequentialism. That is not what Kant is saying here. Right, he is a non-consequentialist. Also, this is not the golden rule. There are certain similarities to the golden rule in the sense that you're looking at something being reciprocal or universal. But again, the golden rule asks you to treat people how you would want to be treated. And again, Kant very specifically says that what you want has absolutely nothing to do with morality and can't have anything to do with morality. Right? Because morality comes from reason. Reason is universal. The moral law applies to everybody in exactly the same way, regardless of what they want or don't want. Right? Remember, actions that come only from what you want, even if they all accord with your duty, have no moral worth if your motive isn't simply to do them because they're your duty. Okay, so because the golden rule has everything to do with what people desire, right, it is not at all what Kant is talking about here. And again, people who ought to know better will sometimes describe Kant's view as something like the golden rule, and it very much is not. Right, so let's get a little bit clearer. Let's have an example that usually clarifies how this universalizability procedure works. So take as an example this. So imagine I will take what doesn't belong to me as some maxim, that is some principle for action, something that somebody might do. Now consider that if you made that universal, that is, you made everybody say, I will take what doesn't belong to me, right? Then if everybody had that maxim, then the very concept of belonging would have absolutely no meaning. And thus nobody could take what didn't belong to them. Right? Because again, if everybody just takes everything, then nothing can really be said to belong to anybody. Okay, so it would be logically impossible to will that this maxim be universal, and that's why it can't be part of the moral law. Consider one more example, the example of lying. Now imagine that you said, I will, take as a maxim something very simple like I will lie, right? Now imagine you apply it universally. Okay, say, okay, it's a universal law now, everybody lies. And so then you ask, anybody, is there a bathroom on this floor? And if everybody lies, you will understand that when they say no, they actually mean yes, right? And so then you can't ever be deceived with any question. You just ask them something and everybody says the opposite, right? And so all that does is simply changes the meaning of yes to no and etc. And so nobody is deceived by this. And so in a sense, you can't fathom, right? You can't universalize lying, right? Lying only makes sense in a backdrop where most people are telling the truth about most things most of the time, right? Only then does a lie ever actually deceive anybody. Same with theft, right? Theft is only a thing if things actually belong to people, right? And so it's only because almost everybody respects almost everybody else's property almost all of the time that we can even have a concept of those sorts of things. And if we didn't, well, then there couldn't be a concept of theft. And so this is a representation of what you might be able to outline as a kind of argument for universalizability. Again, Kant doesn't do this exactly, but you can sort of see this argument in the way that he argues here. So first, you can consider that he has this idea that reason, okay, the act of reason, reveals the moral law, okay, and also this idea that reason works the same for everybody. Now, it's worth dwelling on that for a second, because you might say, what do you mean reason works the same for everybody? People think differently all the time. Again, reason isn't just plain old thinking of something. Reason is a particular way of thinking. So think about it this way. Imagine if I say, Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal. Therefore, and if you're thinking, Socrates is mortal, then what's going on is you're using a kind of rational process. You're using the rational rule, if A is B and B is C, then A is C, right? Now notice that works the same for everybody, right? Everybody is universally able to do this, at least, and if they're not, they're incapable of exercising reason. And of course, you then would, be sort of exempt from all this. One more example. You say something like, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. Oh, look, it's raining. Therefore, if you're thinking the ground is wet, and if you didn't have any choice but to think the ground is wet, congratulations, you are able, you're basically rational, right? That is, your faculty of reason is working. And notice it works the same for everybody. Right, that's that second premise of the argument. So if you put those two claims together, you get the claim that the moral law then is the same for everybody. And so if you take that and use it as the first premise of a new argument, right, you say the moral law is the same for everybody. And if you point out that some maxim, say maxim X, cannot be held by everybody, then that tells you that maxim X cannot be part of the moral law. And so, again, the Kant's terminology here is very highly technical. Perhaps he has taken a circuitous route toward arriving at this basic moral insight. Perhaps he has made things more complicated than they absolutely had to be. But let's stop here for a second and just do a quick sanity check about what it is that he's really suggesting to us. And I think we should recognize that Kant is here tapping into a very plausible view, right? The idea that many immoral actions are the result of some people making exceptions for themselves. That is, treating their own interests, or the interests of their kin, their allies, their countrymen, or other members of their race, ethnicity, or culture as somehow more significant than the interests of other rational beings. Right? And if you want to sort of make a list of the top 10 moral tragedies in human history, and you say, look, are some of these things, examples of somebody making an exception for themselves, okay? Or sort of deciding, oh, well, the sort of rule that I would expect of anybody toward me, I'm not going to behave that same way toward other people, then I think you'll see that element in there. And so, again, Kant is tapping into a very, very plausible idea, an idea that makes a great deal of sense when we think very carefully about what we think ethics means and what ethics is. Consider also that if you were to make a list of just common things that people do every day that seem sort of wrong, like say lying or stealing or various other things like this. Again, when you sort of confront people with these things, it tends to be revealed that what they're doing is they're sort of considering that, oh, well, look, I recognize that I wouldn't like any of these things done to me, but I was just sort of, I'm making an exception for myself, in other words. And so again, Kant is on to something here. And so a way to very simply put Kant's universalizability idea is this way. If it's not okay for everybody, it can't be okay for anybody. And so one last thing to notice about Kant's universalizability formula is that it generates more negative duties than positive duties. That is, more things that you're not supposed to do, more things that are impermissible than things that are permissible or even obligatory, right? Things that it tells you more what not to do than what you're supposed to do, right? So the idea is if it isn't universalizability, don't do it. Sorry, if it isn't universalizable, don't do it. But if it is universalizable, well, you don't necessarily have to, but I guess you can, right? And so this is where this formula, again, generates more negative duties than positive duties. So at this point, Kant, in the reading, introduces these four sort of illustrations, these four examples of his reasoning. And so first off, he starts with somebody who is suicidal, right? So somebody who's had a rough go of things and resolves to kill themselves to spare further dissatisfaction. Okay, that's the maxim of their action. And he says that as a maxim, that one fails universalizability. That is, to use the very principle that seeks to improve our life, that is dissatisfaction. The reason you're dissatisfied with things is to point at the things that you need to fix, right, in Kant's view. So to end it, that would mean that there is no satisfaction because, of course, then no life. I think it should be fairly obvious why, committing suicide shouldn't be universalizable, because in a world where everybody did that, of course, nobody would be able to do anything because they'd all be dead. And so there's a sense in which that seems logically impossible. And so this idea of killing oneself, really for any reason, certainly to spare dissatisfaction, seems not to pass this universalizability standard. And so Kant says that's going to be an example of something that's immoral. So the second example is somebody who borrows money with no intention to repay it. He says this fails as a maxim because if you tried to universalize it, then, imagine, again, it's a universal law that everybody who borrows money has no intention to repay it. Well, that sort of goes against the very idea of borrowing to begin with, right? So by definition, no borrowing could exist if people didn't intend to pay anything back. So in that sense, the maxim logically defeats itself. Okay. Again, remember, he's not saying, imagine what would happen if everybody borrowed money with no intention of paying it back. No, he's saying just think of the concept of borrowing itself without the concept of paying back destroys the whole concept of borrowing, right? What it means to borrow something is to have something for some time and then pay it back. So then his third example talks about somebody who sort of pursues idleness instead of developing their talents, and he claims that this one fails universalizability because the very nature of talents requires devotion to their improvement. And his fourth example is imagine somebody who decides to do no harm to nobody, but also decides not to help anybody either. So he thinks that this denies that we have any duties to others, but also denies that they have duties to us, and it is in that way not universalizable because we all feel that others have at least some duties to us. Now, I think the third and the fourth of these, to be perfectly honest, are less clear in how they really fit his universalizability criteria, especially the fourth one. But these are illustrations that he in fact gives, and you can see sort of his reasoning there as he applies his own view. Nevertheless, Kant continues on to supply a kind of second formulation of what he calls this categorical imperative, that is this moral law, this thing that everybody is supposed to be bound by. And again, I think that Kant probably thought he was saying, he was giving just different words, a different expression to this universalizability maxim. But, again, it may well be that he's given us just two different categorical imperatives. And so this one reads, so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end and never as a means only. Okay. Perhaps there's a less awkward way to phrase that, but this has become the traditional way of translating this particular phrase. So if we want to translate it into more plain language, we can just say, don't treat people like things. Right? That's effectively what this one says. And so, again, if we want an example of something that might fit or not fit this second formulation of the categorical imperative, we can say something like this. Think about what the moral difference is between something like slavery and something like employment. Right? So imagine that you go to buy a book from the slave of the bookstore owner versus going to buy a book from the employee of the bookstore. So in the first case, that is buying a book from the slave of the bookstore, that's a case of using this person as a means only. Okay, they are being treated as if they are a thing. Whereas using the person in the second case, you go into the store, you pick out your book, you bring it to the counter, they ring it up, they put it in a bag, they give it to you, you give them the money, and that's that, right? In some sense, you have used this person as a means of obtaining a book, right? And so it's true that you've used them as a means, but that's not what the categorical imperative here says. It says you shouldn't use people as a means only. Okay, and so if they're an employee, well, they're there as the result of some sort of voluntary bargain. Okay, that they're saying, yes, I'm going to be here, I'm going to do this thing in order, in exchange for money, right? Is usually the way it goes. And so that's different, right? So you're not using a person as a means only. Okay, and what seems wrong is using somebody as a means only, that is treating them as if they are a thing. What doesn't seem wrong is in some cases we do use people as means to do this, that, or the other thing. Right, but again, we should never use them as a means only. Right, we should always respect their essential autonomy, and that's a big deal for Kant. And so again, let's subject this view to a kind of sanity check. Right? Does this view, in essence, at a very basic level, make sense? And I think we'll find that it does. Okay, the concept of treating people as ends in themselves does tally with some very plausible moral principles. Right, and so again, if you were to make a list of all of the very worst moral tragedies in human history, it seems like another thing that they have in common, in addition to not being universalizable, is that they involve treating people like things. Right, and you think so if you think of rape as a kind of moral offense, slavery, you think of herding people into concentration camps because of their ethnicity, right? All of these sorts of, they treat people like things. Okay, they don't regard people as autonomous, rational beings who are moral lawgivers in their own right, as Kant puts it. Okay. And so this idea of persons being essentially worthy of respect is what underlies our ideas of universal human rights. And that's something that's very, very important when you're thinking about non-consequentialist versions of morality, including Kant's theory of morality, is that these kinds of theories tend to make really good sense out of something like universal human rights. Right? Out of this idea that there is just an essential way that is okay to treat people, and there are certain ways in which it's just wrong to treat people, no matter what kinds of consequences you get from treating them that way, or what kinds of bad consequences there might be for respecting people in some sort of fundamental way. So this kind of fundamental respect is part and parcel of Kant's theory, but of course is notably absent from any utilitarian theory. Okay, there is no utilitarian justification for universal human rights. Again, you might say widespread human rights tend to make for greater pleasures than pains. That might be true, and yet you can think of plenty of circumstances in which violating some right might generate better consequences than respecting the right does. And so that means that, as a utilitarian, you can't say that everybody always has certain rights or that everybody's always entitled to being treated in some way. Again, it depends on what the consequences are in each particular case. All right, and so non-consequentialist theories of ethics tend to have a very nice relationship with what we think of as universal human rights, as opposed to consequentialist theories of morality like utilitarianism, who tend really not to have any concept of universal human rights. And so finally, just a summary, right? Because again, Kant is complicated, and I wouldn't recommend ever sort of going for the nutshell version. Always think very carefully about what's going on. Spend a lot of time in the reading. But again, the highlights, if we're thinking about Kant's ideas, are that first of all, he's a non-consequentialist. Right? Kant does not think that the consequences matter at all to what makes something the moral decision or not. right? Non-consequentialist moral theories in general, including Kant, consider the question of morality to be about action types instead of specific acts. Right? This is This is where that business about maxims comes in for Kant. Right? It matters what kind of action, what kind of motive you have, and not what specific action you're taking. Right, so a non-consequentialist like Kant is able to say that lying is wrong because it's not universalizable or because it treats somebody like a thing. In fact, think about lying for a second and think about how you treat somebody that you lie to. Notice that what you're doing is you're trying to substitute your judgment in for theirs. You're trying to get them to do something that you want them to do, not necessarily something that they would want to do if they had all the facts. Right? And so in a very real way, you're substituting your judgment for theirs. You are treating them like a thing, not as an autonomous agent in and of themselves. And so again, a consequentialist is going to look at a lie and say, well, its rightness or wrongness depends on what happens when you tell the lie, right? Believing that at least some lies might have very good consequences. Whereas a non-consequentialist like Kant is going to say that what matters is the nature of the action itself, right? Whether it can be universalized, whether it treats people in a certain way or fundamentally respects them in a certain way. Okay. Finally, Kant considers morality to be the outcome of one of a couple of rational procedures. So again, this is what makes it an objective theory of morality, because again, remember, reason works the same for everybody. Reason is an objective thing. And so a rational procedure, such that you can say, okay, does the maxim pass this universalizability test? Does it treat people as a means only, right? These are sort of rational tests that you can subject any type of action to and get a result from, again, using your rational faculties. And so for Kant, that's what morality is. It's the outcome of some form of rational procedure. And that's one of the things that makes Kant's moral theory an objective moral theory. It's one of the things that lends to the plausibility of Kant's moral theory.